real verdict day will be November 5th. That's election day. And the Biden campaign folks are echoing somewhat of the same sentiment here. And so we all have to kind of immediately transition into the political ramifications of this verdict today and what that's going to look like in the next couple of months, right?
Andrew, that's certainly top of mind for voters as well as protesters, supporters, and we have to imagine, of course, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Now, as of right now, of course, there aren't any laws that would prohibit Donald Trump for running for office. Of course, there are some conversations of whether or not he could vote or not in this next election. But again, as of right now, he's still running for president. He told his base tonight that he's still fighting for this country and again, will continue campaigning. We know tonight he's actually on the way to a fundraising event. So again, really trying to continue those campaign efforts, as well as he is seeing a lot of fundraising pour in tonight, Andrew. We did see some reports that fundraising really just flying into his campaign site. So much, Andrew, that the site actually crashed moments after that verdict was read. So again, a lot of fundraising, as well as we do expect the president to continue, or the former president, we should say, to continue campaigning for the next few months. Andrew.
Right. Caroline Elliott there live for us in Lower Manhattan. Caroline, thanks so much. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right, in the meantime here, I just want to give kudos there to Caroline Elliott. We've been relying on her so heavily there outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan with really, really valuable information. In the meantime, though, we do want to keep it going with some more legal analysis. I know you still have so many questions because it is a complicated case. On its face, it might seem like it was simple because the 12 jurors in unanimity agreed that Donald Trump was guilty on all 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. But if you go underneath the hood of all of it, it was not so simple, and I think our friend legal analyst Nima Rahmani would agree with that assessment, and he joins me. Nima, thanks for being with us here, and I just have to give kudos to you for being so available today. This is historic. All right, let's start with some of the questions I'm getting from viewers and family and friends. Is Donald Trump going to jail, Nima?
I don't think so. And I know Alvin Bragg didn't tip his hand, and there's the possibility that he can ask for a prison sentence. And it's really up to Judge Juan Merchan. He can sentence Donald Trump to prison. Unlikely, because I think these are Class C felonies, not very serious under New York law. And of course, Donald Trump has no criminal record. And I think it was really telling because the judge was unwilling to jail Donald Trump or hold him in contempt despite his 10 or more violations of the gag order. So I think jailing him, the logistical nightmare of Secret Service protection, the political upheaval and chaos that would ensue in the middle of a presidential election, I don't think it's a possibility. I think he's likely looking at probation, possibility of home confinement, maybe even some community service. I think it would be very interesting to see Donald Trump have to perform some service for the community there in New York. But I think very, very likely we're going to see a sentence of probation in this case. And probation is going to prepare a pre-sentence report. They're going to interview the former president if he'll allow it, if his lawyers do, and they're going to make their own recommendation as well. So at sentencing on July 11th, the defense is going to make a recommendation, the prosecution is going to make a recommendation, and that pre-sentence report will also contain a recommendation, and it'll ultimately be up to Judge Juan Merchan to decide what is the appropriate sentence in this case.
I see. What about a mix, probation and jail? Do you anticipate that? Is that a scenario?
It is a scenario. Sometimes there will be a jail sentence followed by a sentence of probation upon release. So that is a very real possibility in most cases. I don't think so in this case, but that does happen quite often.
All right, today's May 30th, the sentencing is July 11th. What does Trump need to do or not to do in that period to better his chances in the sentencing phase?
Normally, you would advise a criminal defendant to accept some responsibility, show some remorse, show the judge that you take the charges and the guilty verdict seriously. But obviously, Trump is no ordinary criminal defendant, and he's not going to do that. And he's going to come out and continue to blast Judge Juan Merchan publicly and on social media. Of course, the judge is not a part of the gag order, so this is fair game. And during the sentencing, I don't expect Donald Trump to say anything at all. I think his lawyers are going to advise him to remain silent, which is still his constitutional right, while they pursue all appeals. There is a slight possibility that the judge increases the bond amount now that he's been convicted. But again, I don't think that's likely at all. Donald Trump isn't going anywhere. We all know where he is at any given time.
Yeah, Nima, of course, he's not going to be silent tomorrow. He announced there will be a press conference at 11 a.m. Eastern in the Trump Tower atrium. So we'll have to see how he will respond in kind, what his next move will be. I asked you this about the jurors and about, what they might say now that they have been kind of cast loose and free here. Because, the tea leaves, we were trying to read them about what the jury might do, what verdict they might render. We're trying to assess the tea leaves now on the appellate level, Nima. I think that's the next tranche of this story is, what might that look like? What are the scenarios and outcomes that might happen? Say a juror, and we're getting into hypothetical territory here. Say a juror writes a book, gives a TV interview, talks about the case at length. Does the prosecution not want that? Does that interfere with how they approach the appellate level decisions here? Would they prefer the jurors just keep quiet?
No question, Andrew. The prosecution wants the jurors to go home and never talk about this case again because they may say something that may put the verdict at issue. Sort of a recent case, not so recent, but recent here in California is the Scott Peterson case. He, of course, was convicted of killing his wife, Lacey, and his unborn child. And there was a juror that wrote a book about the case and went on one of those tours. And she said some things that showed that maybe she was less than truthful during her jury selection process. And something similar also came up in the Derek Chauvin case when he was convicted of killing George Floyd. There was a juror there that maybe wasn't as truthful as he should have been regarding some of his BLM and other political rallies that he attended. So whenever a juror says something, it may be something that questions the veracity of what they said during jury selection, which may create an appellate issue, or they may bring in an outside influence or some unconstitutional issue that was raised during the deliberations. And if that happens, and the defense can get a declaration from that juror or a statement under oath, then we may have to start this whole thing all over.
Okay, so more hypotheticals, because this hasn't happened yet. Say you have one of the 12 jurors in one of these interviews, kind of ex post facto, we learn that they are anti-Trump, or that they, voted for Biden, or that they posted on social media that they don't like the former president, and it didn't come out during the jury selection process. Is that a nail in the coffin of the prosecution?
I don't think so, unless they perjured themselves during voir dire or jury selection. If they outright lied to the court and it's established that that lie was prejudicial, then maybe, just maybe. But that's a very difficult burden for the defense to meet. You would think that most jurors would be answering questions truthfully. And frankly, these are two very well-funded teams that did a lot of research on these potential jurors. So if there's someone out there that's very anti-Trump or doing a lot of work for President Biden or any Democrat anyway, that's frankly something that the parties would have caught beforehand, and we wouldn't have reached this point.
So Todd Blanche, the lead defense counsel for Trump, he'll be appearing on the Fox News channel tonight with Jesse Waters in prime time. If you're part of this team that has such a loss, what are you going through? How do you get up tomorrow morning knowing that this was such a resounding loss?
It's a tremendous defeat, and Todd Blanche has to be really licking his wounds here. And look, I've lost cases. Any lawyer that's tried cases has lost. So, and sometimes you take the tough case, and this was not an easy case to defend. I think the challenge with Blanche, though, will be that I think it's just a matter of time before Donald Trump blames him for this loss. There were reports that he was not happy with him and how aggressive he was. And you and I have talked repeatedly about the strategic legal errors that I think Blanche and the defense team made. Now, I'm not saying this case was winnable, But I think he lost a lot of credibility with the jurors in his opening statement, as well as his closing arguments. There were things that he said that he didn't deliver on and were just outright untrue. And then I know the president didn't think that he was aggressive enough with respect to Michael Cohen, but maybe it wouldn't have mattered because this case ended up not being about Cohen at all, but about Trump, Pecker, and others.
You know, I asked our last legal guest, and I'm going to ask you this now. In hindsight, do Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen come out better as witnesses? You know, the conventional wisdom was they were completely non-credible, that one, you know, is a former porn star, the other is a convicted felon himself. Is that conventional wisdom still true? Or, in hindsight, were they beneficial to the prosecution as witnesses? Were they not so disreputable?
I think both are true. I think, you know, you're still talking about a former porn star that had an affair with a married man and was paid not to tell her story. And Michael Cohen, I mean, we've gone through all the lies and his felony conviction, but I think there probably is some vindication now that they took former President Donald Trump down with them. I think they thought that they took the fall for this and they came out looking bad when really he was involved in this sordid, scandalous affair. And now, just like Michael Cohen, Donald Trump is also a convicted felon. Maybe he won't be doing time for it, but they're one and the same, essentially.
Wow. Nima, did you watch the Alvin Bragg press conference with his team of prosecutors behind him? If you did, what did you make of it? You had indicated that it was going to be somewhat of a victory lap, and it was. But what did you make of Bragg's demeanor, about his tone, about, you know, whether or not he was kind of happy that he brought the case, or that this was satisfied or justified here? You and I have talked about the risk of bringing such a novel legal strategy to prosecution here. What did you make of it?
I thought he was a little bit more subdued than I thought he would be. Okay. And let's not forget, every prosecutor in this country is either elected or appointed by someone who is. So many of them have political aspirations. And, you know, when you're talking about rank and file career civil servants, the heads of the office often aren't like that because they have to talk to voters and raise money and do all the things that Donald Trump and Joe Biden have to do. And I think it was a stark contrast between Letitia James, who, of course, sued Trump civilly and won, both before, during, and after the trial. She was just very different, and in some ways boasting about the victory. And I have to really give credit to Bragg for not only bringing this very difficult case and proving it. I wasn't quite certain he would get there, and you and I have talked about that, but he really took the high road and was somewhat of a gracious winner this evening. So good for him. I think, you know, a lot of folks might have, you know, wanted to pop champagne bottles, but he really said the right things. And I think folks are going to have a lot more respect for him because of how he handled himself, both during this trial and after this press conference.
No, to your point, though, and this is my just kind of assessment, he did seem to maintain somewhat of a low profile throughout the whole course of this, which I was not expecting. You know, I thought he was going to be front and center with his team of prosecutors in the courtroom each and every day. But if you're a district attorney, you know, this is not the only matter that you have before you, no matter, and especially being in New York City, one of the biggest jurisdictions in the country. Nima, while we have you, let's talk about some of the political ramifications of the conviction, and that is Trump's eligibility to vote in the presidential election. Our Fox producers have told me that as long as Trump is not incarcerated on Election Day, he will be eligible to vote in the election. Does that stand up here?
Potentially, yes. Each state has its own laws with respect to voting and voting rights. And generally speaking, in the state of Florida, that is my understanding of well. As long as you're not in custody, you can vote. And of course, he can, in the very unlikely event that he's pardoned, he would also regain his right to vote as well.
All right, you know, Nima, July 11th will be here before we know it. And then the prosecution and the defense will issue their sentencing recommendations here, and the former president will be on the campaign trail now that he has been, you know, kind of cut loose from this. He had to be there each and every day. They were off on Wednesdays. As we speak, he's at a fundraiser tonight there, so it does seem like business as usual. But let's talk about the other legal problems he has facing him. We talked about them earlier in Georgia and in D.C. and Florida. I think the conventional wisdom is, and the reporting is, that none of those three are getting to trial anytime soon before the election here. So is there a scenario, is there a universe in which this is it? This could be the only case indictment against Trump to go to trial, to have a conviction secured, and that's it?
I think that's a very real possibility, Andrew. Regardless of what happened today, I think statistically, if you look at the polls, Donald Trump is still the front runner. He is an enigma. He will continue to fundraise off this. He'll probably do even better in the polls because he's been able to walk this fine line ever since he was a candidate. Let's not forget, we talked about that Access Hollywood tape, grab him by the expletive. We thought he was dead in the water, and he won pretty resoundingly over Hillary Clinton. So he may well win in November, and a lot of people expect that he will. And if he does, according to long-standing Department of Justice guidance, the sitting president can't be prosecuted. This applies federally, of course, and also that same logic applies to the state prosecution as well.
Yeah.
If he wins, I expect all the cases to be dismissed, and this may be it for Trump's criminal problems. This may be the only justice he ever receives.
You know, I just want to remind the viewers, too, because now that the Supreme Court's term is coming to an end, and we're going to get all of these rulings. We got the first one today on a case involving, officials there in New York City and the NRA. We'll get into that a little bit later. We're waiting this question on presidential immunity, this ruling, this decision as well. That's going to be in the docket. We don't know when it's coming, of course. Usually these major cases of import happen later in the month of June, and so I would imagine that maybe it's coming then, but that's going to be another update in the Trump legal saga here. It is an answer on that question. It could reshape the presidential race as well, but that's a Jack Smith case, the D.C. election subversion case, that until that question is resolved, a trial date can't be set.
No question. And Judge Tanya Chutkan in D.C. has stayed the case until that decision comes down. And like you said, we're starting to get the opinions at the end of the court's term. Today was a somewhat rare, a unanimous opinion by the justices. I don't necessarily think the presidential immunity decision will be unanimous. I think based on precedent, and there's not a whole lot of precedent, really, the primary case is United States versus Nixon, but historically, there has been immunity for official acts. And I know Donald Trump and his team have argued for absolute immunity for a current or former president. That was rejected by the Court of Appeals, but I do think the justices are going to stick with this rubric of were these official acts, were these personal acts, and I think a lower court is going to have to make a decision on that basis. So we'll probably get a ruling, like you said, sometime end of June, maybe even trickle to July. Yeah. It's going to go back down, but I don't think we're going to get trials in any of the three cases before the election.
All right. You know, Nima, and just for the viewers, you know, we keep talking in hypotheticals. I keep posing you these hypothetical questions because, you know, it is so uncertain. Yes, so much happened today there in the courtroom in Lower Manhattan, and we've been over it ad nauseum. We're going to be doing this throughout the evening here for viewers who are just coming to us for the first time with this news. Another question I keep getting, Nima, is this question that has popped up now that Trump has been facing all these indictments, and that is whether he has the power to pardon himself if he were to be elected again as president here. Help us make sense of that question. It kind of freaks some people out, to be honest. Can he do that in this case in New York if he were elected president?
No, he cannot. This is a state case, so only the head of state of New York, so the governor, would be able to pardon him for these charges. But the presidential immunity, that argument still applies to a sitting U.S. president. And the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice has historically said sitting president can't be prosecuted. So whether it's self-pardoning, whether it's immunity, that would apply, in my opinion, and in the Justice Department's opinion, to all the pending criminal prosecutions. They would go away. Now, he could still be sued civilly. Okay. And we saw this going back and forth to Bill Clinton and, you know, Paula Jones and sexual harassment. That's how the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. But as far as criminal prosecutions, if Trump is reelected, I believe, and the Justice Department believes, that all of the other cases have to be dismissed.
You know, Nima, I just want to remind the viewers too. I mean, the immunity argument was tried in this case, in the Alvin Bragg indictment and prosecution. I mean, the Trump team tried to, get that question adjudicated in New York, among other kind of last-ditch attempts to forestall a trial. You remember they wanted a change of venue. They wanted the judge to recuse himself, and so much of that. Do you think any of those pretrial motions will kind of surface at the appellate level?
I don't think so, and this is why we can go through them one by one. The first is a change of venue, and I mean, this is a trial the entire world has been watching. There's no person in the United States that doesn't know who Donald Trump is. So whether it's in Manhattan or Albany, New York, as long as the prosecution and defense can get a fair and impartial jury, and that's what the standard is in a change of venue motion. And we litigated these, for instance, when I did defense work in the Enron case, for instance, we made these same arguments. Unless the defense can show that it's impossible to get a fair and impartial jury in that venue, that motion will be denied. With respect to recusing Judge Juan Merchan, a lot of the discussion was the political activity of his daughter. But it's pretty well established that a family member's political activity has no bearing on a judge's recusal. We've seen this with Justice Thomas and Ginny Thomas and her political activity.
Sure.
And most recently with Justice Alito. He wrote a letter to Congress saying, I don't have to recuse because the flag flying was entirely my wife's decision. And people might not like it, but Justice Alito was right. So I don't think Judge Merchan has to do anything because of the activity of his family member. So, I think for those bases, I think the appellate arguments will be denied, but that's not going to stop Donald Trump and his team from raising them.
All right, Nima, that was quite the marathon. We're going to leave it at that, though. Before we let you go, where does this story go from here? What do you have your eye on? This was, like I said, quite the marathon of a day in American history, both legally and politically speaking. Where does this go from here?
Well, the concern always is that we've really opened up a Pandora's box, and you hear folks talking about us being one of these third world countries that prosecutes our political opponents. So I understand folks are sharing. I understand other people are concerned, right? We started with a lock 'em up and Hillary Clinton and the emails and the servers and the Steele dossier. Hunter Biden is going to trial next week. Again, I think that's a righteous case and one that should be brought. But, is this the beginning of something really terrible in America? Or is this just one former president who broke the law who's being held to the same standard as everyone else? Yeah. I think time will tell.
Yeah, you talk about Pandora's box. Are you worried? Do you think, your contemporaries, your colleagues in the legal profession, are you worried essentially that, once Biden is out of office, that a district attorney in Florida or Texas or even in redder states like, Wyoming or Idaho, for example, will bring cases against former presidents?
I am. And there was a while, and maybe I've been doing this a long time, that prosecutors were supposed to be held to a higher standard. We didn't see this politicization of the Department of Justice. So, for instance, Alberto Gonzalez was the Attorney General under George Bush, and he actually spoke at my commencement at Harvard Law School. But he faced a lot of pressure because he fired some U.S. attorneys for political reasons because they weren't enforcing criminal cases along the border. Well, obviously, that's a huge issue right now. And at the time, it was such a huge scandal in the Department of Justice that decisions were being made for political reasons. But now you have folks like attorney generals in red states. You have people like Fani Willis. We've talked about Letitia James that are really more politicians than elected officials. So I hope both in terms of the electorate, I hope politicians at the DOJ, we are making decisions for the right reasons, the facts and the law, not because we want to enact some sort of vengeance on our political opponent.
All right, Nima Rahmani, as always, can't thank you enough. And you name-checked the next trial I think you and I are going to be talking about a lot. That, of course, starts June 3rd there in Los Angeles with Hunter Biden, and so that's going to be quite something as well. That's where you're based. I'm sure we'll be talking about that. Nima, thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll talk soon.
All right, in the meantime here, let's take a quick commercial break. We're almost at the